It was here in a small laneway, not far from Dublin City's main thoroughfare, that a note was retrieved from the body of an Irish rebel. The note had been written by Commandant James Connolly of the Irish Citizen Army and leader of the Army of the Republic. In it he declared his confidence that Irish America would not be found wanting as our people struggled to break free from British imperialism. The message echoed the sentiments of the proclamation issued at the GPO several days before, and which acknowledged the support of Ireland's exiled children in America in mounting what would become known as the 1916 Easter Rising. The seeds of this transatlantic support had been sown more than 60 years earlier. At least 1.2 million Irish people died in the years 1845 to 1850 during An Gorta Mór, the Great Irish Famine. Millions more fled across the Atlantic to seek refuge in the cities of the United States of America and Canada. This became the bedrock of support for those seeking to establish the Irish Republic.
I think it originally started with the famine. It's a very radical history. You had 1.5 million people arrive on coffin ships. Nobody except African Americans arrived in worse shape. They came in slave ships, we came in coffin ships. And I think from that point on, it was going to be a radical history. England was the greatest empire on earth at the time. And the only counterweight that the people in Ireland had really was the Irish in America. And you look at the incredible role of men like John Devine and how they popularised this issue. And you look at the Easter Rising itself, I think it's 20 days in a row on the front page of the New York Times. Every event that's happened in Ireland has had an American echo. And the American echo in many ways is the most critical thing.
The American dimension of the central story in Ireland, say leading up to the Rising and so forth, there's huge American dimensions to that, and Irish American, some born here in America, some having emigrated from Ireland to America. But I think it's that aspect is often the most sort of under-recognized or under-attended to, and it makes it a much more complex story than the simple narrative of rebellion within Ireland.
Well, 1916 did not happen in a vacuum, and I think any critic of the 1916 Rising is quite naive. We would not have had a massive hunger in Ireland in the 1840s if Ireland had its own self-government. So the critics of the men in 1916, I really do think they need to actually read their Irish history.
It was against the backdrop of the famine and the failed Young Ireland Revolt of 1848 that the Fenian Brotherhood was founded here in New York City in 1858. Around the same time, the Phoenix National and Literary Society, founded by Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa 2 years earlier in Skibbereen in Cork, merged with the Irish Republican Brotherhood in Dublin. The three secret organisations were committed to breaking, by force if necessary, the connection with England and to establish an independent Irish Republic. The containment of the 1867 Fenian uprising in Ireland and arrest of leaders like John Devine and O'Donovan Rossa were major setbacks. In 1866 to 1870, armed raid from the US into Britain's Canadian territories did not achieve the desired results. However, the revolutionary ambitions of the leading participants was not entirely discouraged. While in prison, O'Donovan Rossa encouraged his young wife to travel to America, where she quickly took up the cause of the Fenian prisoners.
When she came to the United States, she really thought that she would write. She had been writing some poetry. She'd written for the Irish people. She was very much a poet in her own right at the time. And she thought, well, perhaps she'd write for some newspapers.
Yeah.
But when she got here, she was befriended by both Colonel Roberts of the Fenian group that invaded Canada,
yes,
fame, as well as by the other more traditional Irish American groups. Mm-hmm. And they convinced her that she should go and do readings and raise money, in essence, for the Fenian prisoners. And she was 20 years old. And here she was, she comes to the States, she goes and takes elocution lessons at NYU in New York from a famous fellow by the name of Frobisher. And then she goes on tour from 1868 all through 1869. So for 2 solid years, she's on tour in the United States. And she goes everywhere. She, New York, Chicago, Buffalo, Syracuse, Atlanta, Omaha, Nebraska, Montreal, Canada, Toronto, Canada. And she's a 20-year-old. And she wears a green velvet gown with black ribbons on it, and she calls herself the prison widow. And she speaks. She gives readings and poetry readings and some of her own poetry, as well as others. But she takes every opportunity to talk about the Fenians that are in jail and raising money and raising issues so that they would be released. When he came in 1871 after being given amnesty and exile from Ireland and came into New York, he and John Devoy and 3 other Fenians were really treated as celebrities. All the boats came out in the harbor, and fireboats went off and welcomed them into the city. And there were parades, and there were parade up and down Broadway, like in today's ticker tape idea. And they also went to Washington and met President Grant. So they were really treated as big celebrities. And Rasa really maintained that celebrity status for a good portion of his career in the States. His determination to be consistent about building a democratic republic in Ireland by means of force. He never wavered. He never so much as even considered any other viewpoint in all of his history. And so he really is a thread that runs very consistently from 1865 right up into the 1916 Rising.
It was this determination and resolve which inspired cutting-edge military research and development from the US side of the Atlantic. This is Paterson, New Jersey, a major industrial centre on the east coast of America, where John Holland of Liscannor, County Clare, settled. By 1876, he was working here formerly as a teacher of the Christian Brothers, and then increasingly on his scientific projects, most spectacularly the Fenian ram, which basically pioneered the concept of submarine warfare.
But he settles here after a short stay in Boston. He was invited by the Christian Brothers, where he taught math and music at St. John's Parochial School. However, before he came here, his interest really in underwater travel developed while he was following, I think he was reading the Cork Examiner while he was teaching there. He was following the Battle of Hampton Roads during the American Civil War in 1862. That was the main battle between the Monitor and the Merrimack, or the Virginia. And he thought this was a really great idea about that low water level, especially of the Monitor that was developed by John Erickson. Because it really he figured it was the end of really battleships, because it would really be hard to hit this low piece.
Yeah.
But then he started to come up with the idea, what if we started traveling from underneath to attack battleship? Unfortunately, his first few days in Boston, it's wintertime, he slips on the ice, breaks his leg, now he's bedridden for 3 weeks. And he was about to go into his trunk where he had his original plans, and he says, let me start over again.
Okay.
So he starts drawing his sketches. And who actually helped him also was his brother Michael, because he was one who really helped him get in touch with the Clan Legal, who was going to actually help finance some of this.
Absolutely.
And it was a James Breslin, who was in charge of this. James Breslin became famous because what he did is he took the ship to Catalba, and they went down to Australia, where they rescued some prisoners.
That's right, 1876.
And they came back to the hero's welcome in New York. I guess they were at Battery Park. And John probably was introduced right then and there to him and John Devoy.
Makes sense.
Anyway, he has his ideas, and he was going to demonstrate with a small little 3-foot model. It went down, came back up. That was enough to attract their interest, and they helped finance the first boat, which he had made at the Dallamatta Works. It was just an experimental model, 1-man submarine, no armaments, just to test the principles. And it was tested right up above the Great Falls here in Paterson in the Passaic River. Went down, which didn't surprise anyone, especially all the newspaper people were there. If a man's going to commit suicide in an iron coffin, no one's going to miss it.
Right.
The headline was "Down Among the Fishes." And it went down, stayed down about an hour, and then it was able to surface. It worked out perfectly. After some months of testing, Holland scuttles her, and she remained at the bottom of the Passaic River for about 50 years, so a group of college students raised her, and they presented it to the city. As for Holland, they were more interested now to have him build a real piece that can actually do some damage against the British.
An operational submersible.
Yes. And they enlist they have to convince, I guess, what's his name, O'Donovan Rossa, who's in charge of the skirmishing fund.
The primary link between the Fenian movement and the men and women of 1916 was Tom Clark, the first to sign the 1916 proclamation.
Growing up in Dungannon, East Tyrone in the 1860s, Tom Clarke was drawn towards the radical republican position espoused by the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which he joined. In 1880, arising from the shooting incident in Dungannon, where two members of the ancient Order of Hibernians had been attacked by the Royal Irish Constabulary, Clarke and a comrade opened fire on the RIC. This meant he had to go on the run, and for a man in his situation, the best option was to travel to the United States of America. In 1880, he did that, arriving into New York and joining the Clonagale No. 1 unit, the unit of the Fenian Brotherhood in this part of the world, controlled by John Devoy. John Devoy became, throughout his life, a major mentor of Clarke, and Clarke ultimately represented Devoy's interests in Dublin in 1916.
He is one of the giants of Irish American media. In many ways, he defined Irish American media. He stood out, at a time of huge general newspaper publishers in New York. He was the Irish American equivalent of the likes of James Gordon Bennett of the New York Herald. And of course, Devoy had worked in the New York Herald before he founded his own newspapers. So he was absolutely a dominant figure, an exceptional historical standout. But at the same time, some would say he wasn't fully a newspaper man. He was many other things as well. He'd been a soldier. He'd been in the Foreign Legion. He was just a man of many parts and many talents. He was a polymath. Probably in a place like New York City, there would be two main ways of getting the word out there, and that would be mass meetings or a mass newspaper. And you had an awful lot of people. You've got to remember, Devoy came a little after 1860, but in 1860, 1 in 5 people in New York City had been born in Ireland. The Irish were pouring ashore here in their thousands, ready to make a new life. Some of them passing through New York City, but a lot of them staying. And this was the audience for John Devoy.
In 1883, Clarke went on a bombing mission to England to try and advance the cause of physical force republicanism. He was quickly compromised, jailed for life, and endured a very debilitating period of imprisonment until 1898 when he was amnestied. During his time in England, he fell into company involuntarily with men like John Daly, a major figure in the Irish Republican Brotherhood in the far south of Ireland. By 1900, finding it impossible to make a living in Ireland, he migrated once again to the United States of America, where he reconvened his connections with John Devoy and the reorganized clan structures on this side of the Atlantic.
The timing was propitious, as the July 1900 convention of the clan reunited rival factions under Devoy's guidance and engendered a new sense of purpose. Other notable figures, such as Joe McGarity, Luke Dillon, and Dr. Pat McCartan in Philadelphia, John T. Keating in Chicago, John T. Ryan in New York, and Judge Daniel Cohallen in New York City, endeavoured to revive and develop the revolutionary conspiracy. It was McCartan's return to Ireland in 1905 that facilitated interaction with Bulmer Hobson, Dennis McCullough, and Sean McDermott, who were similarly engaged in a parallel Irish Republican Brotherhood reorganisation.
In 1905, Tom and Kathleen Clarke moved out of New York City here to Mandeville, Suffolk County, Long Island. He took over a 60-acre market garden farm for which he tried to make his living. By the following year, he was a naturalized US citizen, and the combination of his detachment from the radical politics of New York City, his acquirement of diplomatic protection, and his solidification of his domestic life made it more possible than ever for him to actually advance the cause of the Irish Republic. In December 1907, Tom and Kathleen Clarke returned to Dublin, where he quickly assumed a prime position in the Irish Republican Brotherhood. In March 1896, Dermot Lynch from Cork, one of the key people in the transatlantic Fenian connection, migrated to New York City. He became deeply involved in cultural and political affairs of the United States, particularly as president of the Gaelic League in New York and as one of the leading figures in the Philo Celtic Society.
Dermot Lynch was a vice president here at one point. So that organic New York Irish, American Irish, and Native Irish, both back and forth across. I mean, Dermot Lynch was one of the most peripatetic people I could imagine in his travels from Ireland to England to the United States, back to Ireland, where he was the aide-de-camp to James Connolly in the GPO.
When you look at Dermot Lynch's like what he was involved in and so forth, it's so extraordinary, and yet what's all equally extraordinary is how unknown that name is at this point in time.
Certainly. And he was able to straddle the two worlds of culture activity in America and New York in particular, and advanced revolutionary clandestine work at the same time.
Right. And so the interconnection between cultural activities and the Irish language revival and political movements is it's inextricable. And there was the Philo-Celtic Society here, which preceded the Gaelic League in Ireland. I mean, so it's always interesting to see ways that diaspora communities sort of retain, and in some ways in a very kind of fervent way, connection to certain aspects of the home culture, and then that feeds back into the culture itself. And I think all that kind of very rich and ferment going on in the years leading up to the Rising, both here in the States and very much so in Ireland, is it's a very sort of complex field of activity.
On returning to Ireland by 1908, he became reintegrated with the Clan na Gael allies in Ireland, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and after that he became the premier emissary attending Clan biennial conventions in Atlantic City, New Jersey. This is the site of the St. Charles Hotel in Atlantic City, New Jersey, right on the boardwalk and facing directly across into the Atlantic. It's here that every 2 years the National Organisation of Clan na Gael would meet. Delegates from all states would assemble to discuss the business of the Irish Revolutionary movement in America in secret and occasionally having a public session. Every time they met, delegates were received also from the Irish Republican Brotherhood. In September 1912, Sean McDermott, using the name Burke, attended. In that capacity, he met with members of the Revolutionary Directory, comprising John Devoy, Joseph McGarrity, and John T. Keating. The deepest secrets of the conspiracy to create the Irish Republic were partly planned in this location.
The tempo of political change in Ireland gathered pace, and with it the prospect of advancing revolution. A bill in the British Parliament promising limited home rule in the form of a devolved assembly in Dublin was passed in April 1912. If a potentially valuable step on the long road to independence, Irish Republicans could not countenance continued membership of an imperial monarchy. However, opposition to even these modest proposals for devolution from Ireland's minority pro-British unionist communities set the stage for a dangerous impasse. Encouraged by senior figures in Britain's Conservative Party, Irish Unionists founded the Ulster Volunteer Force in January 1913 to resist Home Rule by violence if necessary. Uncertainty as to the attitude of the British Army if called upon to enforce the authority of Westminster exposed the non-democratic nature of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland.
The formation of the UVF in early 1913 gave the Irish Republican Brotherhood the excuse it wanted to mobilise a much larger section of the Irish population. On the 25th of November 1913, Óg and the Irish Volunteers were founded here at the Rotunda Hall at the top of O'Connell Street in Dublin City. This was the mass-based armed nationalist organisation that the IRB revolutionaries wanted to bring about the Irish Republic.
The much smaller Irish Citizen Army also emerged amid a gruelling labour dispute in Dublin in 1913. The ICA was a trade union militia which followed James Connolly.
The Hiberno-Scottish Socialist Republican James Connolly relocated from Troy, New York to this part of New Jersey in 1905. He was predominantly interested in organising unskilled workers, and specifically those working in the silk industry. This naturally brought him into contact with the industrial workers of the world, who specialised in basically organising and unionising people, including female workers, who the traditional engineering unions wouldn't touch.
Thank God for James Connolly. He definitely did wonders for women and women's rights and equality. Organized the unorganized as well as the skilled workers. Mm-hmm. He once said that women work double work, meaning that they work their regular jobs and have to go home and be housekeepers as well. Right. He was way ahead of his time as being a feminist, And we thank him for it. I personally thank him for it, being an African American and being on a job that is male oriented.
Connolly was had a heart for and was organizing low-wage workers, immigrant workers, and just by no coincidence, the exact type of workers that the craft unions would exclude. And Connolly had a heart for that, and today the legacy is here. You know, these industrial unions in New York and across the country that are organizing low-wage workers right now, in some cases very successfully. Those roots could be found in the teachings of Connolly in New York in the early 1900s. I think Connolly certainly got an eyeful over here, particularly as it relates to Ireland, not the working class in Ireland, not standing alone as having those problems as unique to Ireland. I mean, he came over here and recognized that workers face the same plight in America as they did in Ireland. And certainly when he went back to Ireland, he found this blend of Irish nationalism and the drive for equality for the working class.
On the 2nd of April 1914, a women's auxiliary to the Irish Volunteers, Cumann na mBan, was established in Wynn's Hotel, Dublin. This represented a tangible manifestation of female political rights at a time when the suffragettes and other campaigning bodies had not secured votes for women.
Certainly, if you look at what led up to the 1916 Rising and I suppose what was happening in Irish society with sort of the formation of Cumann na mBan in 1914 and women, and I suppose a lot of politicisation of the Irish society and people thinking about what it meant to be involved in politics, what it meant to be a nationalist. I think that certainly Cumann na mBan must have had some influence in the writing of the proclamation. So while they may not have been directly in the room, I think they definitely influenced those that did write it.
Well, one of the more remarkable things about the Rising itself was how many women participated, because it was extremely unusual to have women in a frontline situation anywhere, and it was not happening, for instance, on the Western Front.
Absolutely not, and I think it's a bit tragic that they have been wrote out of history up until probably now with the centenary. People are realising just their involvement. Most people probably thought, oh, sure, they were really in the back room of it, but no, these were women who were actually fighting in the Rising. They were tending to the wounded as well. And if you look at Kathleen Lynn, who was a commanding officer in the Rising, so they were actually fighting alongside their male counterparts at every different role that was necessary, right up until, I suppose, if you actually look from the beginning with the 14-year-old raising the flag over Liberty Hall, and then Elizabeth O'Farrell who delivering the surrender note. So from the very beginning to the very end of the what happened over the course of those days in the Rising, women were at the forefront of it.
Dubliner Sidney Gifford, Republican feminist and trusted associate of Clark, MacDonald and McDermott, relocated to New York in June 1914, where she founded two branches of Cumann na mBan. Gifford noted that while the Clan did not possess a women's affiliate, the Ladies Auxiliary of the AOH proved to be some of our most valuable workers. Diarmuid Lynch and Thomas Ashe left Cork for the US on the 12th of February 1914 to raise funds for the Gaelic League, but also to conduct more secretive business. Lynch was IRB envoy to the biennial convention of Clan na Gael in Atlantic City, and ultimately reported behind closed doors to his revolutionary directory comprising John Devoy, John McGarity and John T. Keating. Another Irish language enthusiast and educationalist, Dubliner Patrick Pearse, also set sail for the US. Pearse arrived in New York in February 1914, firstly to raise money for his experimental school St. Denda's in Rathfarnham, and secondly to raise money for the Volunteer Equipment Fund. In that capacity he was feted and indeed hosted throughout the East Coast of America by John Devoy in New York, Joe McGarity in Philadelphia, and he interacted also with Bulmer Hobson, the man who had vouched for him in the first instance to the Clan na Gael networks in America. This is the Brooklyn Academy of Music, where on the 1st of March 1914 Pearse gave probably his most important political speech to date, when in his capacity as director of the Irish Volunteers, aka Oak na Heron, he more or less told a capacity Irish-American audience that there was going to be political ferment in Ireland. Amongst those in attendance was Governor Martin Glynn of the New York State and the renowned Irish-Australian soprano Maureen Norell. This was a very high-level performance. He finished off by telling everyone in attendance that before the generation had passed, the Irish Volunteers would draw the sword of Ireland. IRB leader Bulmer Hobson unexpectedly joined Pearse. Joe McGarity subsequently hosted both men in Philadelphia on the 23rd of March 1914. Engagements in New York, Rhode Island, Delaware and Massachusetts ensured that Pierce, protege of Clark, was well known in Irish America. It was no coincidence that the early months of 1914 witnessed the interlinked activities of Lynch, Ashe, Pierce and Hobson with a coterie of allies in the US. Events on the other side of the Atlantic in April 1914 had profoundly altered the context of their respective missions. Pierce, following Hobson, sailed for Ireland on the 7th of May 1914 in the midst of political turmoil. The importation of substantial quantities of firearms and munitions from Germany on 24th of April 1914 bolstered the menace of the UVF to the Home Rule Bill. Crucially, the manifestation of this challenge inspired Republicans to reassert the primacy of the Irish volunteers. Devoy knew that a volunteer gun-running operation was already in the offing and arranged the collection of a substantial sum of money. By mid-June, £1,000 raised by McGarity had reached MacNeil ahead of sums massed in a dedicated volunteer fund from the 5th of July. When Volunteer Treasurer Roger Casement made an overture to the privileged London-based circle of Alice Stopford Green on the 8th of May, a loan of £1,500 was readily secured. This stopgap funding was used by Darrell Figgis and Michael V. O'Rahilly to procure a shipment of 1,500 rifles from continental suppliers. Casement was aware that if all went to plan, the consignment would be landed in the fishing village of Howth, near Dublin City, on the 26th of July 1914. Casement travelled via Glasgow and Montreal and was in New York by the 20th of July, where Devoy advanced $5,000 for additional weapons. He too met Cohalan before moving to Philadelphia in order to join McGarity on the 26th of July 1914.
Joe McGarity is a hero many times over. His organizational skills here in America in bringing the folks together to fund the cause in Ireland that led to the rebellion is legendary in the Philadelphia lore. And I think it's fitting that we're here today. Today is Election Day in America, a symbol of freedom in America. And when he was here in America, he knew that Ireland unfree, he would never be at peace. And therefore, he organized very carefully and very confidentially those that supported the cause. And he was able to maneuver the resources to the homeland that led to that epic struggle.
I mean, this is a city that also hosted Luke Dillon and Pat McCartan, so it's got a range of very notable Fenians, but he appears to be preeminent.
He is. It's a name that resonates in the Irish community to this day. I grew up hearing about the heroes in Ireland and the patriots, and his name would come off the lips of the folks that would teach me the stories as if he was there himself.
McGarity was one of the most eclectic and important figures this region and perhaps the nation ever experienced. He both was a revolutionary, businessman, poet, songwriter, an emerald miner. He ran the gamut and was reputed to have lost several fortunes and gained several back. He was friends with many of the Irish revolutionaries and then later government officials of the Republic of Ireland. He was investigated by both the FBI and the precursor to the FBI, the Bureau of Investigation, and those are quite telling documents which we have access to here. Indeed, Casement and McGarity were friends. He and De Valera at one point would always stay at McGarity's home when they were visiting Philadelphia, which was a central location on the eastern seaboard of the United States. They were both correspondents as well as friends. In particular, some of the Casement material, given his martyrdom, can be quite telling.
Yes.
An example of this would be a handkerchief embroidered with Casement's name that McGarity cherished throughout his life. It's really a very important token of their affection to one another.
They anticipated good news from Ireland. The yacht Asgard, piloted by Erskine Childers, arrived that day as planned into Howth, carrying a portion of the contraband. When news of the brazen daylight importation at Hoth arrived in Philadelphia, it electrified the huge pro-Irish community. The Norwegian-built Asgard had been the wedding gift of the Bostonian father of Mary Molly Alden Osgood, following her January 1904 marriage in Massachusetts to Erskine Childers. American Molly Childers had played an active part in the risk-laden proceedings in the North Sea and into the Irish Sea. Once docked in Hoth, selected Irish volunteers, aided by Na Fianna Éireann Republican youth, spirited the weapons away to safety. A delighted McGarity presented Casement with a further $4,000, and the challenge of procuring additional sums was considerably eased. However, the delight was tinged with anger and sadness. The British response to the landing of guns was to kill 4 civilians in Dublin city centre later the same day.
On the 2nd of August 1914, the Irish in Philadelphia rallied here in Washington Square. They did so to protest the shooting dead and bayoneting of 4 Irish civilians at Bachelor's Walk in Dublin. The Philadelphia Irish heard speeches from Roger Casement in the company of John Devoy and the local leader of the Irish community, Joe McGarity. Casement subtly said that the Irish here are mad with anger, but filled with pride, joy and hope. The procession from Washington Square came down past Independence Hall and turned down Chester Street towards the Garrick Theatre. En route, they reenacted, in the form of a mock funeral, the procession of those who'd been shot dead in Bachelor's Walk in Dublin.
Efforts by John Redmond to control or neutralise the Irish volunteers in June 1914 created tensions which reverberated in the US, where the Irish World newspaper was deemed unduly sympathetic towards the Irish Parliamentary Party perspective. Pearse reported on such matters to McGarity from Galway on the 12th of June 1914, when Redmondite nominees to an expanded provisional committee of the Irish Volunteers were pressing to transfer most of the rifles to the Hibernians led by Joe Devlin in Belfast, on the grounds that they might be required for self-defence from the UVF. Hobson had lost favour by acceding to Redmond's demands. McGarity's request for a briefing on the situation required action. Following discussions with Clark and McDermott, former Philadelphia resident Dr. Pat McCartan, a man of high standing in the IRB, paid his own fare to the US in July 1914. Within one day of meeting McGarity, the pair went to New York to see both Devoy and Casement. This provided McCartan with a sense of clan ambitions for a major arms showing in the context of the coming war between Britain and Germany. He obtained £2,000 in gold for the IRB. Britain's entry into the Great War on the 4th of August 1914, the same day the US confirmed its neutrality, exacerbated the situation. Redmond had not only to contend with the shelving of the pending Home Rule legislation for the duration of the conflict, but the attitude of Westminster's emergency national government towards its relatively small political party. Diarmaid Lynch, still travelling in the US with Thomas Ashe, recalled that on the outbreak of the war in Europe, the Clan na Gael decided to raise a fund for the Irish volunteers. Ashe returned to Ireland with McCartan on the Derry route, while Lynch remained in order to brief the Revolutionary Directory and others within the upper echelons of the clan. Lynch eventually returned to Ireland with a clan bank supply draft for £2,000, carefully secreted, and an automatic pistol for personal use. On the 19th of September 1914, Redmond verbally committed the Irish Volunteers under his influence to the Imperial War effort in France and Belgium. The result was a split in his membership. The much reduced core of this, who dissented, were now concentrated on the leadership of the IRB members and Republican acolytes. Strategic scope for offensive action increased, and those who believed that England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity were bolstered. Pearse warned McGarity that the Irish Volunteers remained militarily incapable of seizing the occasion of the Great War to strike unilaterally. US status as a neutral did not simplify the fraught logistics of shipping large quantities of illegal war materiel across the Atlantic. McGarity, however, was well positioned to connect emissaries of the Irish Volunteers with Count Johann von Bernstorff, German ambassador in Washington, D.C. Devoy had similar entree with the staff of the German consulate in New York, and high-level meetings were held in the city's German club. The international fame of Casement as an opponent of imperialist despotism was immensely useful for the clan and the IRB. The Irishman met ex-US President Theodore Roosevelt on the 9th of August 1914. Amidst near total secrecy, Casement conferred with McGarity and Devoy in Judge Cohallen's East 94th Street home on the 5th of October 1914, at which time he was gifted $3,000 in gold to finance a hazardous wartime trip to Germany. A letter of introduction from von Bernstorff to Imperial Chancellor Theobald von Bethlen-Hollweg was secured, and armed with this imprimatur, Casement sailed for Norway 10 days later en route to Berlin. A fiery speech delivered by Pearse at the Dublin grave of Fenian hero Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa on the 1st of August 1915 left few in any doubt but that Republicans were unreconciled to the country's status within the British Empire. Rossa had succumbed after a long illness in St. Vincent's Hospital, Staten Island, New York. The repatriation of his remains to Ireland attained considerable political importance, and the ceremony was preserved for posterity by filming.
Letters of Mary Jane's, particularly to John Devoy and a couple of others within her family, about right when Rossa dies. And prior to Rossa dying, so I would say like in about 1913 or 1914, maybe even before that, Rossa had actually committed to West Cork that he would be buried in Skibbereen and have a public funeral in West Cork or in Cork. And they were really, the Cork Association, particularly in the United States, was really counting on that. They were really anticipating that this was going to be their party. And really, by the time when he did finally die, Mary Jane is very much the key person to Devoy that says, you know, this could be a lot bigger than doing it in Cork. And that was when Devoy evidently got in touch with Tom Clark, and then they agreed that they would do this in such spectacular fashion, and then Clark and Devoy, of course, pulled that off. But it was Mary Jane who recognized what an opportunity it was. And there's a wonderful quote from her where she talks about how important her husband could be in his death that would have only been near enough to what he would have dreamed about in his life. And she was right.
By then a fully fledged IRB member, Pearse continued to work closely with Clark. The military committee of the IRB, to which Pearse, Plunkett and Eamon Ceannt had been co-opted, began to formulate concrete plans to use the Irish volunteers to mount an uprising. Intermittent communications crossed the Atlantic in both directions. The decision of the Military Council of the IRB to mount the uprising on Easter Sunday, the 23rd of April 1916, was carried to Clonagale in New York by emissary Tommy O'Connor. Devoy learned the secret on the 5th of February, and by the 9th of March obtained firm undertakings from German contacts that they would indeed contribute rifles and munitions. The IRB planned to use the cover provided by Irish volunteer manoeuvres on Easter Sunday to spring into action and occupy key positions in Dublin City. This would signal widespread secondary uprisings in most urban areas, supported by diversionary attacks. The Irish Republic would be declared, and diplomatic recognition for an ancient small nation solicited by telegraphing Washington DC, Berlin and Paris. The rebels were to be equipped with German weapons imported to Kerry on Good Friday, the 21st of April, by the transport Aud as per the planning of Casement and Devoy. Casement duly landed from the U-boat 19 at a secluded location amid severe communication problems which induced him to question the viability of the bid. His capture near Bannostrand, Kerry, removed him from the equation. More seriously, the breaking of German naval codes by British intelligence ensured that the Aud was intercepted by the Royal Navy. Captain Carl Spindler scuttled the vessel off Don's Rock, Cork, in a bid to prevent discovery of its cargo. On learning of what had transpired, Owen MacNeill published notices cancelling the Sunday exercises. Dublin Castle discerned that no urgent threat to British authority in Ireland was probable, and both the Chief Secretary and Army Commander-in-Chief were absent in England for the remainder of the holiday weekend. During the night of the 22nd of April, Judge Cohallen phoned McGarrity in Philadelphia, conveying a message telegraphed from Valentia Island, Ireland. It simply stated, "Tom successfully operated today." Authenticated by the agreed attribution, O'Sullivan, clan leaders were apprised that the armed assertion of Irish sovereignty was imminent.
Undeterred by MacNeill's countermanding order, Clark, Pearse, McDermott and Connolly and others of the Dublin-based leadership of the Irish Republican movement commenced what's known as the Easter Rising here at the GPO on the 24th of April 1916. The formal declaration of the Republic took place just under the Grand Portico when Pearse read the text of the 1916 proclamation.
The 6 days of the Republic ensued at midday, the 24th of April 1916.
The GPO headquarters of the Provisional Irish Government came under very intense British shelling from two major sources, a gunboat from the Helga, firing from the River Liffey quite indiscriminately, and also from artillery using the grounds of Trinity College Dublin on the south side. Collectively, they devastated the entire environs of O'Connell Street. After 6 days of destruction and fire, the Pearse, Connolly, McDermott et al. Relocated to new premises on Moore Street. The headquarters of the provisional government re-established itself from the GPO down here through the laneways behind Moore Street and burrowed through a tunnel of houses on Moore Street itself. It was from there that James Connolly issued his last communique as Commander-in-Chief of the forces in Dublin. In the week of the rebellion, obviously, hundreds of people were killed and many more were injured due to the shelling, the indiscriminate machine gun fire, just the general combat. What always struck me as one of the more poignant deaths was that of the O'Rahilly.
Yeah, and I think, when you hear about, I suppose he was left out to die on the street, and that, when people tried to take his body away, when the ambulances came along and he was still alive, I think he was alive for up to 19 hours lying out there, that it's horrific death that he must have had. But also what was very poignant was the note that he had pinned onto him, which was addressed to his wife, and that he wanted her to know, his darling Nancy. And it was just that human element of it, that this was a man who originally wasn't in favour of the rising itself, but once it was an inevitable, he took part and gave it his whole. I think the famous quote from O'Rahilly was, I helped wind up the clock, so I might as well hear it strike. But yeah, there's that human element of it, that this was a man who, died fighting for his country, but at the very end, his thoughts were with his wife and his family. And, to him, it was his darling Nancy, and just to let her know that, that he fought a good fight. So yeah, I think it's the human element of it, and this was anybody whose lives were lost over those few days. They all had families, but particularly, when you have someone who must have the courage it must have taken to sit and write that note.
After bitter urban fighting, during which British shelling devastated the environs of O'Connell Street, Pearse authorised the surrender of forces from his relocated headquarters in Moore Street. At least 314 had been killed, of whom 64 were rebels. British military forces suffered a minimum of 116 fatalities, with 16 Royal Irish Constabulary and Dublin Metropolitan Police dead. The political consequences were far more difficult to quantify. Within days, a further 15 of the 90 sentenced to death have been executed following rudimentary courts-martial. They included American citizen Tom Clark and recent US visitors Pearse, McDermott, Plunkett and Connolly. On the eve of the surrender, Connolly had issued a document from the Army of the Irish Republic Dublin Command. The text was recovered from the body of V. O'Rahilly, who had been killed by enemy fire in Henry Place just around the corner. Connolly had written, "We have every confidence that our allies in Germany and kinsmen in America are straining every nerve to hasten matters on our behalf. Never had man or woman a grander cause, never was a cause more grandly served." The message was ultimately disseminated posthumously, but on the 29th of April, the Gaelic American announced, "Ireland in arms, fighting for freedom," on the basis of cipher telegram through to New York in spite of the British censor. The Gaelic American carried full text of Ireland's Declaration of Independence on the 6th of May 1916, when the human toll of the rising was being ascertained. Americans then knew that Clark had been shot by firing squad in Kilmainham prison on the 3rd of May. He was the first US citizen put to death by the British in the 20th century. Others marked for execution in 1916, most notably Eamon de Valera and Dermot Lynch, were spared the ultimate sanction by a vicarious combination of military administration and intervention by the US consulate. Lynch was the subject of an appeal by President Woodrow Wilson, which secured commutation to 10 years penal servitude. The heartfelt efforts of Theodore Roosevelt did not, however, secure a reprieve for acquaintance Roger Casement. He was hanged in Pentonville Prison, London, on the 3rd of August 1916. As authentic reports of Easter week filtered into the US print media, the irrepressible Sidney Gifford was comforted by those who appreciated her politics. Austrian diplomat Rudolf Kommer greeted her action-faced by saying that events in Ireland were the talk of all the embassies in Washington, and that the general impression was that we had struck a blow to British prestige from which she would never recover.
Of course, her devotion to the cause being such that when she and her sister stitched the flag, the tricolor, the green, white, and orange tricolor, and they flew it over the theater, and seeing the success of that with the crowd's reaction to it, she took it out on the road, and she displayed it from the top of a bus going down Fifth Avenue, and she was surprised to see that the New York City cops actually stood to attention and saluted it, recognizing it as the flag of the Irish nation. She was a bit surprised at that, but in my experience, family and traditionally, I wouldn't be surprised at that at all.
Yeah.
With the recognition that the New York Irish would have, the identity they would have with that, and also not only among the NYPD, which always had a very, very pro-Irish Republican, pro-Irish freedom perspective among its Irish American, and frankly with many of my colleagues of different ethnicities, just seeing the basic justice of what it was.
The 1916 Rising and its immediate aftermath stunned the Irish diaspora and initiated a comprehensive reorganisation in Ireland and in the US. In the December 1918 general election, Sinn Féin won a landslide victory which precipitated the War of Independence, which commenced on the 21st of January 1919. The Irish Volunteers had become known as the Irish Republican Army. The Friends of Irish Freedom, an American association for the recognition of the Irish Republic, rallied behind the cause as never before. Although the US dimension was not the sole catalyst in spurring the daring insurrection, it was indisputably a major factor in changing the course of Irish history.
Shame.